Opening the center instantly, this pawn thrust immediately stakes a claim for queenside space and prepares development. Sicilians immediately seize central complexity and challenge white's pawn presence. Launching knights centralizes them, eyeing king's flank, creating central space for pawns and preparing further development. Solidifying the center and preparing to develop the bishop opens avenues for active piece play and a flexible pawn structure. A bold check forcing black to compromise pawn structure or piece development, potentially weakening their king's safety for tactical gain. Shielding the king's diagonal, this knight retreats, ready to support potential central advances and prepare for a more solid pawn structure. Castling swiftly secures the monarch, initiating an offensive posture by freeing the rook. Challenging white's bishop prompts a strategic decision, potentially opening lines for black's queenside play. Capturing the knight relinquishes your bishop pair, a significant positional concession that potentially weakens your control of key diagonals. Reclaiming the bishop with the queen's pawn instantly relieves the pressure on the d-file, preparing for active central play. Asserting central space and opening lines for the bishop is paramount, aiming to exploit the bishop pair advantage and potentially launch a kingside attack. Black seizes the open d-file, a crucial artery for piece activity, and simultaneously removes a potentially disruptive white knight that might have anchored itself on c3. This exchange, while seemingly simple, shifts the pawn structure and grants black greater influence over the center, preparing for a more dynamic pawn push later. Reclaiming the pawn with the queen initiates a chase, potentially forcing black's bishop out of its comfort zone and opening lines for white's own pieces while developing an attacking threat towards the kingside. Launching a central pawn thrust, black immediately challenges white's queen and simultaneously opens lines for their pieces, creating dynamic tension in the center and disrupting white's easy development. This aggressive pawn push aims to seize initiative and prevent white from consolidating their slight lead in development. Shifting the queen to d3 creates a flexible outpost, aiming to support a central pawn push while keeping an eye on black's queenside development, potentially cramping their style. Activating the rook on the open c-file immediately challenges white's queen and prepares for potential central pawn breaks, adding immediate pressure along that crucial semi-open file and contributing to a more dynamic pawn structure for black. Establishing central dominion, this pawn push aims to solidify white's queenside space advantage and prepare a potential advance of the b-pawn, while simultaneously challenging black's knight on c8 and creating a more robust pawn structure. Securing the queen's influence over the central files, while simultaneously preparing for potential pawn breaks along the d and e files, now becomes a key objective for black. Solidifying the queenside structure, b3 aims to prepare a queenside expansion by supporting the c4 pawn and potentially enabling a future a4 advance, while also creating a safe square for the queen on c2. Black's audacious pawn thrust on the queenside immediately challenges white's central control and aims to seize initiative, potentially opening lines for its rooks and bishop. Developing the knight to the queenside edge can be a double-edged sword. While it avoids immediate confrontation and potentially prepares for future queenside expansion, it relinquishes control of the vital central squares and allows black to solidify their pawn structure and potentially exploit the open d-file. Black's queen now eyes the queenside, indirectly pressuring white's b3 pawn and preparing to support further queenside expansion, potentially by b4, aiming to undermine white's central control and open lines for the rook. An attempt to stake a claim on the d2-g5 diagonal and prepare for a potential kingside pawn storm, though it also invites further development from black's pieces. Probing the knight's position, black initiates a counteroffensive to challenge white's control of the central squares, subtly seeking to loosen the grip on the d4 pawn and potentially open lines for piece activity on the queenside. Shifting the bishop away from the immediate threat, this repositioning prepares for potential advances on the queenside, subtly challenging black's control of the central files and aiming to exploit any weaknesses that might arise from the pawn structure. Unleashing an aggressive pawn thrust on the kingside, Black immediately challenges white's encroaching bishop and seeks to disrupt the harmony of white's pieces, though it simultaneously weakens the pawn structure around their king and opens lines for potential counterplay. Repositioning the bishop here, after its initial foray, begins a subtle realignment, aiming to improve its scope and perhaps contest the dark squares it previously vacated. Observe how the seemingly passive retreat is designed to eventually support a central pawn push, adding another layer to white's spatial ambitions. Unleashing the knight towards the kingside, black initiates a dynamic pawn advance, aiming to dismantle white's kingside pawn shield and open lines for the queen and bishop. This aggressive maneuver forces white to confront the immediate threat to their king's safety, potentially creating weaknesses in the pawn structure. It's a calculated risk, as leaving the d6 pawn temporarily undefended could invite tactical complications, but the potential rewards of attacking the enemy monarch are significant. Consolidating the knight to a more active central square, while simultaneously preparing to challenge black's queenside space advantage. Solidifying the bishop's influence and preparing for potential pawn advances, this maneuver centers black's development while maintaining a watchful eye on the e-pawn. Gearing up for a central pawn thrust, nc2 readies the queenside knights for potential maneuvers, aiming to reinforce the center or reroute to more active squares, while also clearing the way for a possible a3-a4 pawn advance to gain queenside space. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside can be a double-edged sword. While it disrupts white's piece harmony and carves out potential attacking avenues, it also significantly weakens the pawn shield protecting the black king. This pawn advance creates immediate structural vulnerabilities on the kingside that white will undoubtedly seek to exploit, potentially leading to a sharp, tactical battle where precise calculation will be paramount. The question is whether black's offensive initiative on the flank will outweigh the newfound insecurity of their monarch. Bolstering the king's safety becomes paramount now, as black's pawn push has significantly weakened the light squares around their monarch, creating potential entry points for white's pieces. Challenging white's pawn structure, black aggressively pushes forward on the kingside, aiming to shatter white's defensive shell and open lines towards the enemy monarch. This pawn thrust, while creating immediate tension, does come with inherent risks, potentially overextending and leaving weaknesses behind if white can effectively counter. The goal is clearly to disrupt white's coordinated piece play and generate dynamic counterplay before white can consolidate their central advantage. Redirecting the bishop's pressure from the queenside flank to a more centralized defensive posture, this maneuver aims to shore up the kingside where black's pawn storm has gained significant momentum. The knight on g3, no longer actively harassing the bishop, now finds itself somewhat awkwardly placed, but the white queen remains steadfastly anchored to the queenside defense. White hopes this repositioning will limit black's immediate attacking potential, and perhaps set the stage for a counterplay that exploits the exposed nature of the black king as the game progresses. Unleashing the pawn storm on the kingside now, black aggressively challenges white's central control and aims to pry open attacking avenues. This creates immediate tactical complications, forcing white to reconsider the safety of their king as the pawn chain advances relentlessly. The spatial advantage is being manufactured on the queenside, but this immediate thrust could be a desperate gambit to deflect attention or a genuinely powerful attacking initiative. Unlocking the kingside diagonal for white's queen, this pawn thrust initiates a dynamic exchange, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially expose their king after the dust settles from this central skirmish. Black seizes the opportunity to exploit white's compromised kingside pawn structure, launching a daring knight sortie that pierces the heart of white's defenses. The daring knight aims to disrupt white's coordinated pieces, potentially creating new avenues of attack or forcing unfavorable exchanges. Unleashing a knight to e3 seeks to activate the piece and potentially support a central pawn push, aiming to pry open lines against black's somewhat congested kingside. This maneuver hints at white's desire to exploit the slightly weakened g-file and the potential for piece play around black's king. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, black dramatically breaks open the h-file, forcing a radical reassessment of the immediate kingside safety for white's monarch. Carving open the king's sanctuary with g3 is a bold, albeit risky, decision that directly addresses the advancing pawn chain's boldness, aiming to solidify the monarch's defenses by creating a crucial escape square. The positional sacrifice on d7 earlier has given black a dynamic, yet slightly uncoordinated setup, and now white is attempting to blunt black's aggressive pawn push by creating a solid fortress. Observe how the knight on e3, now without a clear path forward, becomes a potential target. This creates a fascinating interplay of attack and defense, where white's pawn structure is becoming more robust, but at the cost of a slightly cramped position for his pieces. Consider the impact this pawn move has on the dark squares around the king, and the long-term implications for white's piece development. Seeking a more active piece, black repositions the bishop to e6, aiming to develop a more coordinated attack and potentially challenge the f3 pawn's defensive integrity, while simultaneously preparing to connect the rooks and improve the overall harmony of their queenside presence. Rack 1 anchors the c-file, a critical artery of the board, immediately contesting black's control and signaling white's intent to exploit any weaknesses along this open pathway. A bold sacrifice that tears open lines. Black is essentially saying, take my knight. I want the bishop pair and an open g-file to attack your king. The immediate consequence is that white's queen becomes a potential target on the d-file, and the doubled pawns on the king side will likely need careful handling. Recapturing the bishop solidifies white's queenside pawn structure, preparing to contest the c-file and potentially launch an attack down the open lines that will emerge. Unleashing the rook onto the semi-open g-file signifies a bold attempt to disrupt white's king's safety, aiming to exploit the pawn chain's weakness on the king side. Unlocking the c-file becomes a primary objective, aiming to infiltrate black's position along this open highway. Aggressive pawn thrusts like this often signal a desperate attempt to seize initiative, threatening to disrupt the opponent's harmonious piece development. The immediate consequence is a dramatic reshaping of the central pawn structure, creating both tactical possibilities and potential weaknesses for both sides. Shattering the central pawn chain immediately forces open lines, offering a sharp tactical battle where calculating concrete variations becomes paramount. Seizing the open file, black immediately challenges white's central pawn structure and prepares to activate their rook on the queen side. Clearing the central file opens avenues for your queen and rooks, aiming to exploit black's slightly uncoordinated pieces and potentially create threats against the king's safety, especially if the pawn structure on the king side becomes further compromised. The rook sacrifice opens a diagonal for the remaining bishop, transforming the queen side into a tactical minefield where black's pieces must navigate a labyrinth of potential discoveries and threats. Unlocking the queen side and seizing the open file, this audacious pawn thrust creates immediate pressure, aiming to disrupt black's fragile pawn structure and potentially expose their king. Black shores up their queen's diagonal, preparing to reorient the bishop towards the king side for potential counterplay. Unlocking the queenside pawn structure, this capture immediately opens lines for potential endgame play, forcing black to acknowledge the material imbalance and the newfound activity for white's rook on the now accessible open file. Reclaiming the initiative, black's bishop now occupies a commanding diagonal, eyeing the queenside and ready to bolster the central pawn structure as white scrambles to activate their remaining pieces. Navigating the doubled pawns and open files, white boldly reintroduces the knight to a central square, eyeing aggressive potential and reinforcing the queenside. Seizing the initiative, black intercepts the queen, creating immediate tactical complexity and forcing white to consider the consequences of queen redistribution, potentially disrupting their coordinated attack and opening avenues for counterplay. The board's a tangled mess, and this exchange on the queen sacrifices a key attacking piece but simplifies things, potentially steering us towards a more manageable, albeit still complex, endgame where black's active rook on the open file might prove a double-edged sword. The exchange of queens is now complete, ushering in an endgame where pawn structure becomes paramount. Black's capture solidifies their pawn chain on the queen side, potentially creating attacking chances against white's somewhat isolated pawn, while simultaneously freeing the e-file for potential rook activity. Reclaiming the rook to the king's flank opens up the opportunity to contest the open a file, potentially setting up an endgame where controlling this lane becomes paramount for either side's ambitions. Bringing the king to the center now exposes it to too many potential threats, potentially turning a manageable situation into a precarious one. The rook's aggressive thrust to the fifth rank initiates a battle for initiative, aiming to exploit the now open central files and disrupt black's piece coordination. Sacrificing material here opens up a crucial diagonal for the rook, creating immediate threats against the white king, but it overlooks the persistent pressure on the d6 pawn. Liberating the rook from its initial tether, this capture immediately repositions white's heavy artillery to contest the open file, a crucial shift as the endgame looms. Unleashing the rook's power is paramount now, aiming to exploit the newly opened f-file and create immediate pressure against white's somewhat exposed king. Reasserting control over the open file, white repositions the rook to eye the central pawns and prepare for potential advances on the queen side. Pushing the king forward into the active center now is a bold declaration of intent, aiming to participate directly in the unfolding battle and potentially destabilize white's already precarious pawn structure. The rook's repositioning to the open file immediately targets black's isolated pawn structure, aiming to exploit the lingering weaknesses that have developed as a result of the earlier exchanges. Seeking to activate the rook and challenge white's central pawn structure, black pushes their rook into the heart of the action, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially create counterplay down the c-file. Fortifying the central files, the rook's redeployment to the c-file aims to contest control and prevent further encroachment by black's pieces, potentially eyeing a defensive anchor or preparing a strategic advance on the queen side. Stepping back from the brink of immediate capture, black redirects attention to the king side's newfound weakness, preparing to activate the rook and potentially dislodge the dominant knight. Repositioning the rook to the second rank aims to secure the c-file, potentially supporting a future advance or defending against any infiltration by black's rook. Unleashing the rook's power across the entire board, this maneuver aims to exploit the suddenly open a file and potentially create passed pawns or disrupt white's defensive structure with checks, forcing white to react defensively rather than continuing their central consolidation. A tactical repetition is on the cards, signaling a potential stalemate or a draw by threefold repetition. Consider if black's king position offers any viable attack against the white back rank. The rook's sortie to the second rank is a desperate bid to stir activity in a decidedly passive endgame, aiming to disrupt white's centralized king and potentially create counterplay by attacking the pawns. Shifting the bishop to f2 prepares a potential rook lift up the third rank, eyeing the now weakened dark squares around black's king. Securing the bishop's pathway across the board opens up intriguing endgame possibilities, aiming to disrupt white's king's safety in the coming exchanges. Activating the rook on the open file offers a dynamic counterplay against black's somewhat passive bishop structure. Pushing the monarch into the thick of it, this move invites tactical fireworks and forces white to reckon with the king's newfound activity. Asserting presence on the weak light squares now offers white a crucial outpost for the bishop, a piece that has been relatively inactive. Unleashing a check, black aims to disrupt white's newly acquired space on the king side and potentially force exchanges that might offer some relief from the oppressive pawn structure. A desperate attempt to usher the monarch to relative safety, although the pawn structure's fragility and the open files offer scant solace for the besieged king. Pushing the rook forward initiates a complex dance on the seventh rank, aiming to disrupt white's carefully constructed defensive setup. The bishop repositions, seeking to exploit the potentially overextended black pawn chain and open lines of attack towards the enemy king. The king now boldly ventures out, a brave but precarious decision given the exposed nature of the central files and the looming pressure from the bishop on the seventh rank. White will likely seek to exploit this newfound activity by driving the king further back or creating tactical opportunities around it. The rook's repositioning to the d-file finally offers a concrete plan for white, aiming to challenge black's control of the central files and potentially create counterplay on the queen side. Shifting the bishop to the edge of the board aims to activate this piece and potentially support a later advance of the pawn, but it also removes a defender from the king side.